the Indian version of that story, number one, that we didn't want to come here. This was had to be completely foreign to our people. We didn't even speak the same language they spoke.
Times were rough. I mean, people carried guns. There was no crime as such, but there was a lot of violence. People would just get mad and use their guns. That's typical of the early, rather raw days in the little town. We've been a little unusual for a town of our size for all these years, and I think still are.
What you had with Phillips's exponential growth and these other oil companies, you had a workforce that was highly educated, that was unique in a small community in the middle of Oklahoma.
We are Bartians. People who live in Bartlesville and are native to Bartlesville are called Bartians, not Bartlesvillians.
Indian Territory, 1867. The Delaware tribe is being forced to move from their home in Kansas by the federal government. Jacob Bartles, a Kansas businessman married to Nanny Journeycake, the daughter of a Delaware chief, considers a move to the Caney River country.
He was a very successful businessman after the war, and when the Delaware were forced by the federal government to move down here, that was in 1867, Jacob and Nanny and the family stayed in Kansas.
I guess the Indian version of that story, number one, that we didn't want to come here, okay, to I guess, Indian Territory. I think that the federal government felt like that no one could survive in Oklahoma, so they placed a lot of tribes down here, you know. So, but unfortunately for the federal government, I guess, a lot of tribes survived and to this day are doing quite well. But this was had to be completely foreign to our people, because coming from the East Coast and making all those journeys, we're a woodland tribe, Algonquin speaking, and we put in the right with, for instance, the Cherokees, who are Iroquois, you know, and so we didn't even speak the same language they spoke.
Jacob had a lot of property, businesses, and Nanny kept after him and kept after him. And in 1873, Jacob finally said, okay, let's go. And they moved down here. And then ultimately he bought the mill, the grist mill on the Caney River. And he immediately went back to Kansas City and bought finer burrs, the huge round stones that grind the grains, and changed it then from a grist mill to a flour mill.
I think that Jake Bartles was a good man, really, and I think he had the best interest of the Indian community as well as the white community in mind, and I think that he was good for the history of Bartlesville, to tell you quite truthfully.
Incorporated in 1897 as Bartlesville, the community blossomed as merchants and vendors began to develop the banks of the Caney River.
Jacob Bartles had a store, a mercantile, and two men worked for him, Johnstone and Keeler, George Keeler and William Johnstone. They worked for him for a period of time, and then they decided to open their own store, which was on the other side of the river from Bartles' store. And there probably was some hopefully friendly rivalry between the two stores. The community seemed to settle on the side of the river where Johnstone and Keeler's store was. And at the same time, there were talks to get the railroad to come to this area. And Bartles really wanted the railroad to be on his side of the river by his store. And when that did not happen, he decided he would move his store to some land that he owned, which became the town of Dewey. And the stories say that he moved his store on logs, so it rolled and it was continuously open while he moved the store.
What would define and shape Bartlesville then and now was the discovery of oil late in the 1800s. The first commercial well to blow in 1897 was the Nellie Johnstone, named for William Johnstone's daughter. The well was capped because there was no easy way to haul the oil out of the area, but the seal wasn't tight and the wellhead leaked. One winter evening, Nellie and a few friends were ice skating on the Caney River and lit a small fire to keep warm. Their fire ignited the leaking oil and set the wooden derrick ablaze. Between 1918 and 1935, more than half of all the oil produced in the United States came from the region that encompassed eastern Kansas, central Oklahoma, and parts of Texas. Bartlesville was a magnet that drew wildcatters and tycoons alike to try their luck in the oil fields. One young fortune seeker, John Kane, was a lawyer from Kansas who recognized the potential.
And then in 1904, he came here to Bartlesville. A friend had told him that this was a good place for a young lawyer because of the oil activity. And he had a good practice here in Delaware tribe of Indians, the early oil people. He was very instrumental in working with the Department of Interior to establish procedures for the leasing and operation of on Indian land. In the meantime, he was in 1907 the first county attorney in the state. And stories he told about the early days quite different from what we have today. It was a raw, rough, little frontier town with a lot of single men and not all that many married couples and families. And so it was a different atmosphere. Times were rough. I mean, people carried guns. There was no crime as such, but there was a lot of violence. People would just get mad and use their guns. Went to this pool hall that night. They were having a game of 8-ball, and one fellow scratched on the 8-ball and lost the game. And he was very mad, so he takes out his pistol and shoots the 8-ball and hits it. But the bullet ricochets and kills the spectator. Well, no law involved on that. There was no motivation. So that's typical of the early, rather raw days in the little town.
My father was the youngest of the 5 original May brothers, and the oldest of the 5 was my Uncle Ben, and who was somewhat of the pathfinder of the family. So Uncle Ben told the family, we're going to open a store in Tulsa. They did. They opened on North Main Street in Tulsa in 1908. The store was an instant success. They came up to Bartlesville in 1909. And Bartlesville at the time was sort of a microcosm of Tulsa. It was a boomtown of its own. The Nellie Johnstone had come in the 1890s, and the community was just, they had a railroad spur now, and so they were just beginning to reap the benefits of what the oil boom would do.
Henry Foster, a Kansas banker, died while negotiating drilling rights on the 1.5 million acre Osage Reservation. His son, H.V. Foster, inherited the largest single oil lease in the history of Oklahoma, known as the Osage Blanket Lease.
I don't think he was really that keen on coming out here at first.
No.
So, which leads into Diane's story.
Well, the story that our aunt told us was that he was playing poker in Chicago, and he lost. He had gambled the Osage lease, in this poker match, and he'd lost. And so he showed up at the hotel room at the appointed time at noon on a particular day to sign the lease over to the individual who'd won it from him. And that fellow never showed up to claim the lease. And so it was at that time the HV, with obviously nothing left, because if he was gambling his lease, he must not have had much cash, decided to come to Oklahoma and see just what it was that he owned.
Doing business as the Indian Territory Illuminating Oil Company, better known as ITIO, Foster realized the opportunity on the Osage Reservation was too big for his small operation.
When he got here, he realized right away that there was no way that ITIO could develop the entire lease before the lease was up. So what he did was he used this engineering background and went with several surveyors, went out to the lease for weeks, and finally came back with a map. And what he had done was he had surveyed lots, and he would lease the lots to at the time, oil producers like the Gettys and the Sinclairs and the Phillips brothers and whoever. And he would lease those and retain a royalty. And the way the map was checkerboarded was he would lease a lot here and then keep one for ITIO, and then lease another one and keep one for ITIO. And so ITIO had lots of different little lots, out there on the same lease. But what happened was those people, his adversaries, basically wound up developing the lease for ITIO.
And at the same time, you had other oil investors. The Gettys, for instance, came early on, and there are records that show that they stayed in the hotel that sat on the corner where our building is now. So the early part of the century saw a lot of growth. So you had the seeds of 3 large oil companies growing in Bartlesville at the same time.
One of those 3 was Phillips Petroleum.
Frank and Ellie drilled 3 wells that were dry holes, drilled a 4th one. The 4th one was a gusher, and with that, the next 80 were also gushers. And Frank wanted Jane and their son John to come from Creston, Iowa, and join him. And he wrote to her. She refused at first, saying no. He had been writing letters that told about the grungy oil men coming in off the fields, staying in the hotel where he was. And she said, you get me a house, I'll come. And he bought a house that was about 3 blocks from here. They lived in it for a couple of years and then moved into this house once they had built it. Ellie lived across the street to the south of the Frank Phillips home here on Cherokee. And Ellie was the quiet one. He was the one that was the money man, if you will. He understood banking, he understood finances. Frank was the promoter, and he was the one that was the public figure.
They came to the point where they wanted to get into marketing. And so how are they going to market their product? And they're looking for a name. Well, one day, Dad and Frank Phillips were driving with Salty Sawtell going to a lease somewhere, and they're talking about that. And along the way, Frank says, well, we're moving along pretty fast, aren't we, Salty? And Salty said, well, we're going 66. And so there's 66. There's a 66 highway, and that sounded like a good name. So they chose 66, and Dad suggested that they use the shield on the basis of Highway 66, and different colors, of course, but so that's how the shield and the 66 came about.
What you had with Phillips's exponential growth and these other oil companies, you had a a workforce that was highly educated, a white-collar workforce that was unique in a small community in the middle of Oklahoma. And that was one of the unique things about being in the retail business. My dad used to say, between 12 and 1 noontime, the people walking up and down Johnstone Avenue looked like they were on Madison Avenue in New York.
The first smelter was around 1900, give or take a few years. There's a photograph of a smelter's 1907. They smelted zinc. And the ore came from the Miami area, and they built the smelters here because they used natural gas in the furnaces. And they were here until 20 years ago when they finally closed down. The last smelter was electrified. The Phillips workers lived on the east side and south side. And the railroad tracks divided east and west.
In the west side, in the southwest corner of Bartlesville, and to the south and west of the smelters, where the old smelters were, where National Zinc was and everything else, there were different areas that they called different things. Like the whole area was called Smelter Town. Our particular area where the Polacks were and the Germans and the Latvians and so forth was Pruneville. And the reason that it was called Pruneville is because during Prohibition they made whiskey. Not talking about large amounts of the stuff, but they all knew what was happening. Before a raid would come, they would usually be alerted that they were coming because the doctors, the lawyers, and the affluent people were buying from them.
When the Great Depression hit and the Dust Bowl spread across Oklahoma, Bartlesville weathered it better than most. The oil industry continued to expand, and new businesses and new jobs grew around it.
During the Depression era, Frank and Jane Phillips were very instrumental in helping Bartlesville survive. It was a company town, if you will, at the time period. One of the interesting stories that we have is that Frank and Jane spent $500,000 remodeling the Frank Phillips home, which in reality was in Jane's name only. But it was a business deal, I believe, that Frank saw would help the company, would help the city.
A unique invention by a Russian immigrant would find its home in Bartlesville. The submersible pump, developed by Armis Artunov, was an innovation that revolutionized the way oil could be produced.
He was part of the Russian aristocracy after the revolution in 1917. And his family literally walked out of Russia over the mountains into Albania to escape. He put together an invention for a submersible pump to be used in the field, which was quite unique. And he had a hard time getting somebody to back him. Happened that he met Frank Phillips at a party in California. Phillips was very much aware of how Bartlesville needed employment. And he says, "I tell you what, I'll back you in your venture, but the kicker is you got to build the plant in Bartlesville, Oklahoma." Phillips Petroleum Company backed him 50%. The other 50% was solicited from business people in Bartlesville. And my dad talked about how Frank Phillips walked up and down Main Street. He walked in the store and said, "We're bringing a new company to town. It's going to employ 200 people. And Jake, I got you down for 100 shares of stock." So nobody said no to Frank Phillips.
Coglane Meyer was a young girl living in Bartlesville in the 30s. Her father, James Lane, was nephew to Will Rogers. When Will Rogers came to Oklahoma, he would visit the Lane family and his friend Frank Phillips.
And Mr. Phillips thought during the Depression, what could he do for the town? And he and Dad were talking and Uncle Will in the office one day, and he said, what should we really do? And Dad said, well, I know one thing. All the churches have just started building, and they've got indebtedness. And if you want to help pay off some of those church notes, because the people don't have the money now to pledge like they did. And so he helped pay off church notes during the Depression.
Frank Phillips was wonderful to the kids in Bartlesville. I remember going back, and they'd always have this Christmas party and so forth, and all the kids that attended that all over Bartlesville would get a silver dollar. He'd give every kid in Bartlesville a silver dollar and a big sack of candy. And I never will forget that. And to me, Frank was wonderful, wonderful to the kids and the community of Bartlesville. I mean, he didn't have to do that.
We called him Uncle Frank. Uncle Frank used to give us a bag of candy, a stick of candy with a dollar bill on it. You know, as I look back at those days, I could take that dollar and go to Cress's, H.R. Green's, and buy a present for almost everybody in the family with that dollar bill. That was a long time ago.
And then also, in the spring, there would be a circus come to town, and he would give out tickets for you to go to the circus. That was real big. They came by train, and then they would march and parade out to where the circus tent was up and everything. And I think they were just little three-ring circuses, you know, but gosh, you can't watch them all. And it was fun.
Other Bartlesville businessmen took measures to ease the pinch of the Depression. H.V. Foster built La Quinta, his home in Bartlesville, and his country retreat near Ochalata during the Depression. Foster's motivation was to create jobs that let a working man keep his dignity.
When H.V. was deciding on people that he wanted to hire to build that house, he selected men that had families, young men that had families, because they needed the work and they needed the money. His background was that of a Quaker, and a lot of times when he would donate money to organizations, he didn't necessarily attach his name to it. And Dad did tell me that he used to do baskets, Christmas baskets, like food baskets for people, and he would take them himself and put them like on their front porch, and not with no note or anything, just a basket of food around the holidays, and that was just one of the things that he liked to do, and he didn't really want anybody to know he did it.
One of my favorite stories, one of my very best friends had a date, had 30 cents. He went to the movie and paid 20 cents for the movie, then went to the drive-in and had his 2 nickels and ordered Cokes. Well, playing with the nickels, he dropped one nickel in the door between the glass and the door frame. And so he had to send one of the Cokes back because he only had 1 nickel. But that money was not as, it was harder to come by in those days.
In the golden era of aviation, Bartlesville was the stage for many flight innovations. Frank Phillips' personal interest in flying found an outlet in sponsoring aviation adventures. It was also a great way to promote the Phillips Petroleum Company. The Bartlesville Airport became headquarters for a number of aviation pioneers.
In the late 20s, Frank saw a need for aviation fuel, and then that's when Phillips went in and started doing research and finding out what would work for the aviation fuel.
In the aviation area, he worked with Billy Parker, who was one of the early pioneers of aviation. He worked with Wiley Post and actually funded Wiley Post as he began to work on his stratosphere suit. He helped him as he was getting ready to try and fly into the stratosphere.
Interesting enough, it was here at Bartlesville that he did his altitude flight, and we skipped school and went out to see him take off, and then he got lost and didn't come back to Bartlesville Airport, but he landed in Muskogee Airport. And so it was already dark and all, but anyway, that was exciting.
Like much of the rest of the country, Bartlesville was prepared to provide work, materials, and lives for the war effort.
During World War II, in the 40s, Phillips was asked to help with aviation fuel, and they went on to supply the bombers and fighters that fuel.
Jim was he was going to have to go to service, so we moved in town with my mother and dad and thought he'd go the next time. But Phillips kept getting him off and getting him deferred. He was running motors and testing high-test gasoline. And one day he came home and he said, "You all don't know what I did today. I was just sweating. I worked so hard." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "They brought me some German gasoline, aviation gasoline, and wanted me to run it. And they were testing it and trying to decipher exactly what the components and all were." And he said, "I was nervous because I knew they didn't have much of it and I didn't want to flub on it."
I guess when Mom and Daddy were first married in 1941, one of his first jobs was in the smelters, and he talked about working the furnaces. And they had what they called the connies. It was a conical shape, and the ore went in over the fires, which melted the ore, and then they had a rake that would drag out the zinc. It would go into a tray, and said you had to be very careful. Because I'm not sure what the temperature of melted zinc is, but had to wear asbestos gloves and heavy clothes. And he worked in the smelters, and very hot, dirty work.
Mike Minich's father, Gus, came to America from Poland and worked his way to the smelters in Bartlesville in the early 1900s. Gus Minich and Henry Ripka decided smelter work was not for them. They opened a grocery store on the west side with $300 combined.
One of the things about the store was my dad opened the store anywhere from 6 to 6:30. And the reason he did that was the smelter shift changed at 7. They went to work at 11 the night before, and it's 110 degrees, and those guys were up against that furnace loading that ore in those connies and everything, and maybe their chests would be blistered, and they'd be filthy dirty, and their eyes would be sunk back in their heads, look like 2 inches. And so they wanted something cold. And so my dad, he thought he ought to sell the coldest beer in town, and he did. And so they would come in, and we had some trees across the street road from the store. And I can remember this as I was a little kid. They'd get 2 quarts of Stag, 2 quarts of Slits or whatever it is, and go over there and sit under those trees and drink those before they went home.
The years after World War II were prosperous for Bartlesville. Businesses were growing and changing. H.B. Foster's ITIO merged with Cities Service, a New York-based company with a main subsidiary in Bartlesville. Foster used his remaining assets to form Foster Petroleum. After his death, Foster Petroleum was operated by his son-in-law, C.W. Dornbos.
Yes, our grandmother eloped. She had met our grandfather at Kansas, the University of Kansas, and they eloped, and she was not very happy about that, and so C.W.'s first job was out in the oil fields as a roughneck. He became ultimately the president of Foster Petroleum, but he didn't start there.
During the 50s, the local economy prospered with the oil industry, while teenagers of Bartlesville found their own ways for having a good time.
Yeah. And of course, we were cruising before we were driving because we knew guys were old enough to drive. And this one character that I ran around with, still one of my closest friends, came to town from Waco, Texas. So Jack arrives in town with a Model A Ford. And boy, what a riot that thing was. You had to stop about every 5 miles and time it. Had a little thing at the front of the engine you unscrewed. You turned it around backwards, put it back in, and turned the fan until it popped in. And you turned it back around, screwed it in, and it was timed then. We would always go over on West Frank Phillips to the Zesto, which was the first soft ice cream place here. And that was our first experience with what was called brown derbies. You take an ice cream cone with vanilla ice cream, a little curly top, and dip it in chocolate, and it would harden on there. But then we would head east on Frank Phillips and ultimately go south to the intersection of 60 and 75. There's a Sonic there now, but it was Johnson's Drive-In at that time, and just about everything happened there. There was people started dating there, and there were fist fights there, and the whole teenage thing.
We used to go to Osage Hills a lot. When I was growing up, we'd go out there, and it's a park out west of town here, and we used to go out there and gather and have a big time. But I think all of us cruised every once in a while down there, and my dad was always one that liked cars, and so he always had a fancy car, and so I got to borrow it every once in a while.
We couldn't drink. We couldn't drink in Oklahoma at that time. Everybody went to Caney, Kansas. I didn't do that. And we would just cruise town, and there were 3 of us that ran around together. All West Siders, and in my car, my old jalopy, and we'd just go out, and we never got into trouble because our parents were very strict. Because I tell people I talked back to my father one time, and I never did that again. I found out that wasn't healthy.
I went through a wonderful time. I graduated high school in '57, and it was great during that period of time. I mean, to me, I have fond memories of growing up.
The present-day skyline of Bartlesville took shape during the prosperous years after World War II.
We have the only high-rise office building Frank Lloyd Wright ever built. He built in Bartlesville, which is the H.C. Price Company Price Tower.
H.C. Price came to the Bartlesville area in 1913. He established the Price Electro-Welding Company and developed an electric welding technique for constructing oil and gas pipelines.
His firm then became a specialist in laying pipelines, but then also coating them with chemicals that would prevent them from corroding in the field. So he had this vested interest with other oil entities in town to provide them with the service of not only laying their pipeline, but then coating it with chemicals as well. Mr. Price is looking for a larger facility to house his growing company, and he approached Bruce Goff, who was the Dean of Architecture at University of Oklahoma at the time. That's where the two Price sons, Harold Jr. and Joe, were attending. And Bruce Goff actually said, well, this is a project that sounds like you need a larger architect, so let's look at somebody like Frank Lloyd Wright. And he made the connection, actually, between the Price family and the architect. So the family members went up to Taliesin, which was Frank Lloyd Wright's home and school at that time, in 1952, and met with him. And I think they really walked in the door not wanting more than a small office building, 3 or 4 stories, nothing to really make a statement. And they left that meeting with the Price Tower, which was, a 19-story office building of very strange materials for the time. It's made with concrete, it's made with aluminum and copper, and most of the office buildings, especially skyscrapers at that time, were designed with steel and glass. So it was an opportunity for them to make a statement, but not make a sort of an overzealous one. They still wanted it to relate to the downtown. They wanted it to relate to the scale and the size of the community. And I think that the fact that they were able to not only build the building, but then continue to see it grow in the community and provide a backdrop for a lot of the other buildings in downtown really says something about their commitment to modern architecture. In 1956, when the building opened to the public, there were approximately 17,000 people living here. We had almost 13,000 people visit our building those first 3 days that it was open. So it was very much part of the community life. You saw this building being constructed over a series of years.
And I went to the grand opening with a buddy of mine and made an interesting discovery that day. We got up on about the 15th floor, and if you've been into the Price Tower, and you know how the outside stairs, and you step out one of the offices and you're in a patio area. Well, we were up there and we both looked over the edge, and all of a sudden Alan was on the floor. And that's when he discovered that he had autophobia.
Meet the 66ers, many-time national AAU champions, one of the nation's top-ranking basketball teams, a fast, smooth-running machine that consistently piles up points against the toughest opposition the country has to offer.
During that era, Phillips had not only doing quite well in the oil business, but they also had a basketball team called the Phillips 66ers that was a great endorsement for Bartlesville. They traveled all over the world and went to the Olympics and did the whole thing. So they were a great ambassador for Bartlesville.
Phillips started playing basketball as a company back in 1923. And they've had teams ever since then until 1966-67 season. They quit playing because the professional teams were getting television rights, and the companies couldn't compete with the salaries from the basketball teams. Phillips used the basketball team to travel around in their marketing territory for advertising and public relations, and it gave a person getting out of college a chance to come and play 3 or 4 more years of basketball and then have a job. Most of the players at Phillips stayed with the company and worked long enough to retire.
The 66er team were our heroes growing up as school kids. They played one year a team from Oakland called the Oakland Bittners, who came to Bartlesville, and 2 of their outstanding players were black. One of them, Don Barksdale, was an All-American from the University of California, absolutely marvelous player. And they came to Bartlesville. The team stayed in the hotel that sat on this property. There was no place that would take black people to stay. Boots Adams was chairman of Phillips Petroleum Company. He was embarrassed beyond words. They had to get friends from the black community to take these 2 players into their homes for the time they were in Bartlesville. Boots was so furious that he immediately started plans for developing their own hotel, which is the Phillips Hotel. And that's the reason Phillips got into the hotel business way back then, because he would never have that happen again. And it never did.
I didn't know nothing about racial stuff growing up because we all stayed to outside, as we went to get on the train to go up to my grandma's or something like that. It had the colored side and the white side. So during that time of growing up, we would go fishing, spend a lot of time out here where they got the Phillips Research Center, Liza Creek, and then as we got older, we had our little golf course in the junk pile, like Fat Albert. We had our own little golf course.
When I came here, I thought it was the armpit of the world. And I've said that in any and every opportunity I've had, because it was a cliquish town, and the black people became like invisible people moving in and out of the west side of town, the area where we all lived. And at the end of the day, when you left someone's home and had finished cleaning or whatever, you went back into the black community and were swallowed up there. There were very few opportunities for social exchange. For me, it was just not right, and I didn't really want to be treated like a second-class citizen just because of the color of my skin.
Douglas School on the west side was the separate but equal school for black students in Bartlesville.
At Douglas, everybody was somebody. During my high school days was, kind of like my most memorable experience.
Integration began in 1956 when the high school classes from Douglas moved to College High.
During that time of that they started school integration back in '56 was the time that was pretty rough on black kids going to school, because they would be called names, and a lot of them just kind of dropped out of school at an early age, maybe the 9th grade or 8th grade or something. And things got different, in the later 60s and 70s.
It was a time of change all across America, breaking down the barriers of race and gender. In response, Phillips Petroleum launched a work-study program in the late 60s.
It was an offer for 6 people, especially women, to go on a work-study program and learn to type and be secretaries or clerks at the company. So after being a part of all these other organizations in town, I was asked to be a part of it. And I thought I would go to work at Phillips and work a couple of years and then be out, because I had absolutely no secretarial training until I went to school and learned typing and shorthand. Not good at either one, but not willing to stop either. So I was put on the first work-study program, worked and attended school for 8 months, and then went on the permanent payroll in August of 1968.
But during all of that time, you were gradually seeing a lot of change in the community. I think there was a lot of compliance at Phillips through their human relations people, and of course a lot of federal laws had been passed in the late 60s and 70s that were eventually causing a change in the workforce. I ran for the state senate against an incumbent native Bartlesville person, and was badly beaten. I think I got 38% of the vote. My children were very young, and there was a lot of criticism that I would even think of running for a position that would take me at least part of the time out of Bartlesville and in Oklahoma City during a part of the week. And there was great criticism that I would leave my children at their ages to do such a thing. You know, the world has changed, and it has changed here in Bartlesville, America, and it's going to continue to change. And diversity is simply, I think, something that enriches all of us. And I think more and more people see diversity in that way, that, you know, we're all a part of a great tapestry, and how boring would it be if it was all the same whatever.
With thriving industry and robust economy, there were opportunities in Bartlesville to enrich lives in other ways too. The arts, for instance.
We have a lot of college degrees in town because of the connection to Phillips. And a lot of people who live here have lived in larger communities, and they got used to having the artistic amenities in large communities. And they came to Bartlesville and said, there's no reason why we can't have these things here.
This building where we are now was a Carnegie Library, and a group of the ladies, including my mother, had a Tuesday club, and they made arrangements to buy the land and contact with the Carnegie Library people to build the library. So that's how the library. And as far as the building is concerned, I came when I was 5. There was no kindergarten in the public schools, but the librarian had kindergarten. So I came here as a 5-year-old for kindergarten, and then used the building as a library for several years. And then after the war, when I came back in '46 and was attorney for the school board, I met in here with the school board for many years until they moved to another location, and then bought the building in 1980. So I've been using this building for 85 out of my 90 years.
Bartlesville residents such as myself will remember Varian Cheney. She actually taught acting classes, and I started in those when I was in kindergarten and stayed with them most of the way through high school. And so that set me on a path to have community theater as a hobby for the rest of my life. Community theater has a big tradition in Bartlesville, what we now call Theater Bartlesville. And prior to that, we called it the Bartlesville Theater Guild. And prior to that, we called it the Little Theater of Bartlesville. But it's the same organization, charter-wise, that was organized in the 1920s.
We have a Taliesin West Design Performing Arts Hall that would do a community of 500,000 justice. It seats 1,800. Has the finest acoustics in the country. And because of its location here, we have our own symphony orchestra, we have our own choral society, we have our own ballet guild. Which all, what does it have to offer? It's got lots to offer.
Our new community center had just been built. And in fact, it wasn't even completely really open. And the choral society and members of the symphony and their families were invited to a Christmas party. And they came to the community center stage and did sort of a spur-of-the-moment performance of Handel's Messiah. And that was the first performance the Choral Society ever gave. OK Mozart came about. It's a great story. Ransom Wilson and the Celesti New York Orchestra was a part of the Community Concerts Association concert tour package. And of course, they'd been playing in all sorts of terrible auditoriums and gymnasiums, and they came and played at our community center. And Ransom Wilson at that time said, "Gosh, this is such a great facility. It would be a wonderful place to have a summer festival." And he happened to get connected to one of our great, wonderful, innovative thinkers and can-do people, Nan Buehlinger. And she started talking it up and organizing it and raising the money for it. And before you know it, we had OK Mozart. And it's been such a joy to our community ever since.
The Bartlesville oil industry did not go unnoticed in the business world, and big investors came calling.
In 1984, Phillips Petroleum Company, there was an attempted takeover first by Boone Pickens, and then after he was fended off by Carl Icahn. And it changed Phillips Petroleum Company and to a great extent changed Bartlesville forever.
During the 1980s, during the takeover attempts, the citizens of Bartlesville really rallied behind Phillips. They made cookies in the shape of Phillips 66 shields. They had picket lines with children. They had shirts made, and it was just an enormous support from the citizens of Bartlesville.
During this period of time, there was a lot of other companies that were being taken over and divided up. Oil companies in those days were worth more dead than alive. We were at a very difficult time. We had a huge debt, and we had to retire our debt. And we went from around 30,000 employees to 20,000 employees worldwide. Had to sell off assets.
But when I knew that Phillips was really cutting back on the frills was when they stopped their support of the fill-tones. The fill-tones was a Bartlesville tradition. They did a lot of harmony, a lot of barbershop and popular tunes, and they wore little jackets reflecting the company's colors. They were available if your little organization was having its annual banquet and you wanted to have some information, you could call the fill-tones and they would come and sing, and they did a good job and it didn't cost you anything. And when they announced that they were cutting off their support of the fill-tones, that was a signal to me that they were really, really, really serious about cutting back on unnecessary expenses.
We fought the takeover and survived the Boone Pickens takeover, and then right after that, Carl Icahn tried it, and we found a solution to that as well.
Bartlesville has endured in the face of adversity and prosperity. The city's uniqueness is evident in the sense of ownership felt by most Bartians.
You have all this cultural aspect of it that's mixed, and everybody feels pretty comfortable with it. You know, they haven't set the Indian people over here at the side and saying, okay, we want you to, you have your own community here. They've merged, and interacted with the city, and it's been healthy.
I've enjoyed living here. I've traveled around the world. My husband is buried here. I plan to be buried here. But when I've traveled outside of Oklahoma and outside of the U.S., I'm always glad to get back here, because there's no place like home, and Bartlesville has become home.
I think that's our gift here in Bartlesville, our gift that we give to our kids. We encourage them. We tell them we believe in you. And maybe that's not as unusual as I think, but I think it really is.
Of course, no community is immune from change. The business landscape in Bartlesville has undergone transitions over the 100 years since statehood. The smelters have been closed for decades. City's services and Price Electra Welding are gone. Of the large oil companies started in the early 1900s, only Phillips Petroleum, now ConocoPhillips, maintains a presence in Bartlesville. Regardless of the gains and losses of fortune, Bartlesville has always been blessed with people whose visions go beyond just making money. People who cultivate an atmosphere of innovation and community. People who call themselves Bartians.